John was an ordinary man living in a busy city where most people were too caught up in their own lives to notice anyone else. He worked as a mid-level employee in a well-known company. His job wasn't glamorous and he wasn't rich, but he was honest and hardworking. What made him stand out was not his position or wealth, but his heart. John had a way of seeing people differently than most. Where others saw strangers, he often saw stories. Where others ignored, he noticed. He lived alone in a small apartment not far from his office. His life was simple. Wake up early, catch the bus, work all day, and return home tired but satisfied. Many of his colleagues aimed for promotions, luxury, cars, and fancy houses. John didn't mind those things, but they were never his main goal. For him, life was about small acts of kindness, helping a coworker carry files, holding the door for someone, or sharing his lunch with a guard outside the office. Little things like that made him happy that his parents had raised him to believe that everyone deserved respect, no matter who they were. His mother often told him, "John, you never know what someone has gone through. A smile or a kind word might be the best thing they get all day." Those words stayed with him. Even years after his parents passed away, he carried their lessons like treasures in his heart. At work, John wasn't the loudest or the most social. He often kept to himself, working quietly, but his colleagues knew he could be trusted. If someone needed help, he was the first to step forward. If a new employee felt nervous, he would guide them without expecting anything in return. Yet, despite his good nature, John was sometimes overlooked. He didn't dress in expensive suits, and he didn't brag about his achievements. Many people at the office thought he was too simple. But John didn't let their opinions bother him. He believed character mattered more than appearance. Outside of work, John lived a modest routine. He enjoyed reading old books, cooking basic meals, and taking long walks in the evening. Sometimes he would stop to chat with the old man who sold newspapers on the corner, or he would buy a sandwich for the stray dog that hung around near his building. He was the type of person who could make friends with anyone, not by trying hard, but by simply being genuine. One thing about John was that he never rushed past people in need. On his way to work, he often saw homeless men and women sitting quietly by the roadside. While most people avoided eye contact, John would nod, smile, or sometimes offer them a cup of tea. He didn't have much money, but he believed kindness didn't always cost anything. A little attention, a little care, that was often enough. Because of this, John carried a warmth about him. People who spoke with him, even once, could feel that he truly listened. In a city where everyone was always in a hurry, John's presence was like a pause, a reminder that humanity still mattered. Even though he was humble, John had dreams too. He wanted to grow in his career, maybe buy a slightly bigger place one day, and find someone special to share his life with. But he never chased these things at the expense of his values. He often told himself, "If I can go to bed at night knowing I did something good today, then that's enough." This way of living set the stage for something extraordinary. Without realizing it, John's small daily choices to be kind and respectful were shaping his future in ways he couldn't imagine. He didn't know that his simple belief that people are more than they appear was about to be tested in the most shocking way. And it would all begin with one act of compassion that seemed ordinary at first, but would soon change his life forever. It was a Friday evening, and the city streets were buzzing with their usual noise. Cars honked impatiently, people hurried past one another, and the bright lights of stores reflected off the wet pavement after a light drizzle. John had just finished another long day at work. His company was preparing for its big annual office party, and everyone at work had been talking about what they were going to wear, who they were going to bring, and what surprises the management had planned. Unlike his colleagues, John wasn't overly excited about such gatherings. He preferred quiet evenings, but he had promised himself that this time he would attend. On his way home, John decided to stop by his favorite little cafe for a cup of tea. He liked that place because it was small and cozy, and the staff always greeted him with warmth. As he walked toward the cafe, something caught his eye. Across the street, sitting on a bench under a flickering streetlight, was a woman. Her clothes were old, faded, and torn in some places. She had a scarf wrapped tightly around her head, though it looked more worn than warm. Her shoes seemed too thin for the cold pavement, and her posture was slightly hunched, as though life had weighed heavily on her shoulders. John slowed down, his eyes drawn to her face. There was something about her that seemed unusual. Unlike most people who begged or shouted to get attention, this woman sat quietly, staring at the ground as if lost in her own world. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and she didn't seem to bother anyone. People walked past her without a glance, as if she didn't exist. Some even looked at her with annoyance, as though her very presence was an inconvenience. John felt a familiar tug at his heart. He knew that many would simply keep walking, but he couldn't. Something about the quiet dignity in the woman's posture struck him. She didn't look like someone defeated, but rather someone carrying a story no one cared to ask about. He stood there for a few moments, debating with himself. He wasn't a wealthy man, and he couldn't solve all her problems. But he thought, maybe I can do something small. At least I can treat her like a human being. Crossing the street, John walked slowly toward her. As he got closer, the woman lifted her head. Her eyes startled him. They were tired, yes, but they also carried a certain depth, a kind of strength, hidden beneath all the hardship. For a moment, John felt as though she had once lived a very different life. "Good evening," John said softly. Not wanting to startle her, the woman blinked, a little surprised. Most people ignored her. It took her a second before she answered, her voice gentle but weary. "Good evening. Have you eaten anything today?" he asked, noticing how thin she looked. She shook her head slightly. "Not much," she admitted, her tone quiet, almost embarrassed. Without hesitation, John gestured toward the cafe. "Would you join me for a cup of tea and something to eat?" For a moment, the woman looked at him as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. Then, with a hesitant nod, she stood up and followed him. Inside the cafe, people glanced at them curiously. Some customers frowned, clearly uncomfortable at the sight of a well-dressed man bringing in a homeless woman. John noticed the looks, but he ignored them. To him, she was not someone to be ashamed of. She was simply another person who deserved kindness. They sat by the window, and John ordered tea, bread, and a hot meal for her. When the food arrived, the woman ate slowly, as though she hadn't had a proper meal in days. John didn't rush her. Instead, he sipped his tea and started small talk, asking about the weather and the city. Bit by bit, the woman relaxed. She told him her name was Mary. She didn't give many details about her life, and John didn't press her. He understood that some stories were too heavy to share with strangers. What struck John the most was her composure. Even in her worn clothes, she carried herself with a certain grace. She said thank you softly after each sip of tea, after each bite. And John could see she had once known a different kind of life. He wondered silently how someone like her ended up on the streets. As they talked, John remembered the upcoming office party. An idea formed in his mind, strange, perhaps even foolish, but he couldn't shake it. Why should she spend another lonely night on a bench when she could experience warmth, music, and company, even just for one evening? The thought grew stronger, and finally, John smiled at her. "Mary," he said gently, "my company is hosting a party tomorrow night. It's nothing fancy, just food, music, and people gathering. I don't usually go, but I'd like to. And I'd like you to come with me." Mary's eyes widened in shock. She looked at him carefully, searching his face to see if he was joking. But John was serious. "Why me?" she asked softly. "Because no one should feel invisible," John replied. And maybe it would be nice for you to be somewhere warm, even just for a night. For a long moment, Mary was silent. Then, slowly, a small smile formed on her lips. A smile that looked like it hadn't been there in years. She nodded. "All right," she whispered. John felt a quiet sense of peace. He had no idea that this small act of kindness was about to lead him into the most surprising and life-changing event of his life. The next day, the city was alive with excitement. For most employees in John's company, the annual office party was a big event. People spent days preparing, buying new clothes, booking salons, and rehearsing how they would impress their bosses. For John, however, this year felt different. He wasn't thinking about showing off or trying to impress anyone. His mind was on Mary, the woman he had met the evening before. All morning, he wondered if she would actually come. After all, it wasn't easy for someone in her situation to walk into a world so different from her own. But he had seen a spark in her eyes when she agreed, a spark that told him she wanted to trust someone again, even if just for one night. By evening, John arrived at the place where Mary usually sat. To his relief, she was there, waiting. She had made an effort. Her scarf was tidied, her clothes brushed as neatly as possible, though still worn. When she saw John, her lips curved into a shy smile. "You really came," he said warmly. "Wasn't sure if I should," she admitted. "But something told me I could trust you." John nodded. "I'm glad you did." Before heading to the party, John stopped at a small boutique near the venue. He had saved a little money for emergencies, but tonight he thought it was worth spending. Inside the shop, he helped Mary pick a simple dress. Nothing extravagant, just something clean and comfortable. When Mary saw herself in the mirror, her eyes watered. She hadn't looked like this in years, like a woman who belonged, rather than someone invisible to the world. When they finally entered the hotel ballroom where the party was being held, all eyes turned. The room was decorated with shimmering lights, elegant table settings, and a grand chandelier hanging overhead. Laughter filled the space as colleagues greeted one another, glasses clinking and music playing softly in the background. John led Mary inside, walking with quiet confidence. But the whispers began almost immediately. "Who's that with him?" Someone muttered. "Isn't she homeless?" Another whispered with a smirk. What was he thinking, bringing her here? John heard them, of course. They're judgmental. Eyes followed every step he took. He noticed how some people shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Mary, while others whispered behind their hands. But he ignored it all. He had invited Mary because he wanted her to feel human again, not because he cared about the opinions of those around him. Mary, however, felt the weight of their stares. She held her hands close to her chest, her shoulders stiff. For years, she had lived unseen on the streets, but here, under the bright lights, she felt exposed. John leaned closer and whispered, "Don't worry about them. Just enjoy yourself. You're my guest tonight, and that's all that matters." His words comforted her. Slowly, Mary allowed herself to breathe. She glanced around at the decorated hall, the tables filled with food, and the sound of music filling the air. It had been years since she had been part of such a gathering. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of belonging, at least at John's side. John introduced her to a few people, though most of his colleagues were polite only on the surface. They smiled stiffly, then quickly moved away. Mary noticed, but she pretended not to. Instead, she focused on John, grateful for the kindness he showed her. The highlight of the evening came when the music changed and couples were invited to dance. John extended his hand to Mary. She hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand in his. As they moved gently to the music, people around them continued to whisper, but John didn't care. In that moment, he felt proud, not because he had done something bold, but because he had chosen compassion over judgment. Mary looked up at him, her eyes shimmering. "You're different from the others," she whispered. "How so?" John asked softly. "You see me," she replied. "Not just what I look like or where I've been, but me." Her words touched John deeply. He realized how rare it was in the world to truly be seen, to be valued for more than appearances. That simple truth made the entire evening worthwhile. As the night went on, John made sure Mary had food, drinks, and comfort. He checked in on her often, guiding her gently through conversations, shielding her from the worst of the stares. To him, this wasn't an act of charity. It was an act of humanity. She wasn't a project or a problem to solve. She was a person, someone who had stories, memories, and dignity. The act of kindness that started with a simple invitation grew larger in meaning as the night unfolded. It wasn't just about giving Mary a warm meal or a chance to dress up. It was about offering her a moment of normalcy, a reminder that she was still worthy of respect and joy. John knew he might face questions later, maybe even ridicule from some colleagues. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the smile on Mary's face as she laughed at a small joke, or the light in her eyes when she tasted dessert, or the way she straightened her back as though remembering who she once was. What John couldn't know was that this small act, the decision to bring her here, to treat her with dignity, was not just an evening's kindness. It was the opening chapter of a story that would change not only his life, but also hers, and even the lives of many others in that very room. And as the party continued, the whispers grew softer, but the bond between John and Mary grew stronger. The night, meant to be just another office celebration, had become something far more extraordinary. The ballroom was filled with light and laughter, but the moment John and Mary stepped inside together, the atmosphere shifted ever so slightly. At first, people simply glanced toward the door, expecting to see another employee with a polished guest or a glamorous date. But when they realized who had walked in, the smiles froze, and the whispers began to ripple through the crowd like a silent wave. John, in his modest suit, walked with quiet confidence, guiding Mary gently by the arm. Mary, dressed in the simple but clean outfit he had bought her earlier that evening, tried to stand tall, but she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes piercing her. She was no stranger to stares. People often looked at her on the street with pity, judgment, or annoyance, but this was different. These were John's colleagues, people of status, people who believed they belonged in this grand ballroom. And here she was, stepping into their world as if she didn't belong. Who is she? A woman near the buffet whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "I think that's the woman who sits near the cafe downtown," someone else added with a smirk. "What on earth is John doing?" Another voice muttered. Mary's cheeks grew warm, and she lowered her gaze. Her first instinct was to turn around and leave, to retreat back to the cold but familiar streets where no one expected her to fit in. But before she could take a step back, John squeezed her hand gently. "You're fine," he whispered with a reassuring smile. "You're my guest. That's all that matters tonight." Those words gave her strength. She lifted her head just a little, though her heart raced. They walked deeper into the ballroom, and John began greeting a few colleagues. Some forced polite smiles, others gave curt nods, but their eyes betrayed their discomfort. One of his co-workers, Michael, leaned in with a smirk and said under his breath, "Quite the choice of date, John. Trying to win Employee of the Year for charity work?" John didn't flinch. Instead, he replied calmly, "She's my guest. Treat her with respect." His tone was firm enough that Michael's grin faded, and he walked away. Mary heard the exchange. A part of her wanted to disappear, but another part felt a flicker of gratitude. Nobody had defended her like that in years. The music played softly, but to Mary, it felt distant. Every laugh, every clink of a glass seemed magnified, as if the entire room was focused on her presence. She sat down at one of the tables with John, trying to steady her nerves. The tablecloths were crisp white, the silverware gleaming, and the plates filled with food she hadn't tasted in years. For a moment, she wondered if she was dreaming. When the waiter approached to serve drinks, he hesitated slightly, glancing at her with uncertainty. John noticed. "She have the same as me," he said firmly. The waiter nodded quickly and poured the glasses. Mary's eyes softened. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up for her like this in such small, quiet ways. As the evening went on, John tried to include Mary in conversations, but it wasn't easy. His colleagues asked shallow questions, their tone dripping with hidden judgment. "So Mary, where are you from?" one woman asked, her smile sharp, as if she already knew the answer. Mary hesitated, her throat tightening. She didn't want to reveal her struggles, not in front of these people. "From around here," she said softly. The woman raised her eyebrows, clearly unimpressed, and turned back to her drink. John quickly changed the subject, steering the conversation toward work and lighter topics, shielding Mary from further discomfort. But he could see the tension on her face. He leaned closer and whispered, "Don't let them get to you. You don't owe them anything." Mary nodded faintly, clutching her glass with both hands. She wasn't used to being defended, and it made her chest ache with a strange mix of gratitude and sadness. Then came the dancing. The music shifted to a livelier tune, and couples moved to the center of the floor. John, without hesitation, extended his hand to Mary. She looked at him in shock. "Me?" she whispered. "Of course," he said with a smile. Her heart pounded as she let him guide her to the dance floor. She knew people were watching, whispering, even laughing. But as John held her gently and they moved with the music, something inside her shifted. For the first time in years, she felt like a woman again, not invisible, not forgotten, but present, around them. Some clapped politely, others rolled their eyes, but John didn't care. To him, Mary wasn't defined by the streets, her clothes, or the whispers around them. She was someone who deserved dignity. By the end of the dance, Mary's nervousness had softened into a shy smile. She felt lighter, as though John's steady presence had lifted the weight she had carried for so long. Still, she couldn't ignore the stares, the judgment, and the sense that she was an intruder in this polished world. What Mary didn't know was that this awkward, uncomfortable evening was building toward a revelation that would shake the entire room. The whispers, the judgment, and the stares, all of it would soon turn into silence, shock, and awe. And John's simple act of kindness would prove to be far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. The party was in full swing. Laughter rang through the grand ballroom, glasses clinked as toasts were made, and the music carried a steady rhythm that encouraged more people onto the dance floor. But beneath all the cheer, a quiet tension lingered. Mary still felt the sting of curious eyes and judgmental whispers. John did his best to shield her, but she knew the people around them hadn't stopped questioning her presence. And then, everything began to change. A hush spread across the room as the doors to the ballroom opened wide. A tall, dignified man entered, his presence commanding instant attention. It was Mr. Harris, the CEO of the company, a man everyone respected, admired, and in some ways, feared. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, he carried himself with authority, yet there was always a warmth in his smile when he spoke to his employees. The staff straightened, conversations paused, and many employees hurried forward to greet him. Mr. Harris nodded politely, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries. He was the kind of leader who noticed everything, yet tonight, something else seemed to be pulling at his attention. As he scanned the room, his eyes moved past the familiar faces of managers and directors, past the gleaming decorations and the polished employees eager to impress him. Then his gaze landed on the back of the room, on Mary. It was as if the air shifted in that moment. His steps faltered, his smile faded, and his eyes widened in disbelief. He froze, staring at her as though he had just seen a ghost. Mary, unaware of the eyes fixed on her, lowered her head, fiddling nervously with her glass. But slowly, she sensed the change in the room. The murmurs grew louder, and she felt someone's gaze burning into her. She looked up, and her heart stopped. The man standing at the entrance. The man everyone called Sir. The man she once knew better than anyone in the world. Was her husband? Her breath caught in her throat. For years, she had avoided this very moment. She had run away, choosing the harshness of the streets over the weight of her old life. And yet here he was, standing in front of her, looking at her as if time itself had folded. "Elizabeth," the CEO whispered, though the noise of the room nearly swallowed his voice. John looked from Mary to his boss, confusion flashing across his face. Elizabeth? Who was Elizabeth? He had only known her as Mary. The room fell silent as Mr. Harris walked toward her, his steps slow but steady, his eyes never leaving hers. Colleagues exchanged bewildered glances. Whispers filled the corners of the ballroom. Does he know her? Wait, what's going on? Elizabeth? Did he just call her Elizabeth? John's heart pounded as he tried to piece it together. He glanced at Mary, no, Elizabeth now, who sat frozen, tears welling in her eyes. When Mr. Harris finally reached her, he knelt down, lowering himself to her level, ignoring the gasps of shock from his employees. His voice broke as he spoke, loud enough for everyone to hear, but filled with raw emotion. "My God, Elizabeth, it's really you." Mary Elizabeth closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. For years, she had wondered what she would say if this moment ever came. But now no words formed. John sat there in stunned silence. His act of kindness, what he thought was just a simple invitation to help a lonely woman, had brought her face to face with the most powerful man in the company. The employees stared in disbelief. Their CEO, a man known for his strength and composure, was kneeling before a woman they had whispered about all evening. Elizabeth's lips trembled as she finally spoke. I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Mr. Harris reached for her hands, his own shaking. "I've been searching for you for years. I never stopped looking. Not a day went by that I didn't pray to find you." His voice cracked with emotion, his eyes glistening. Gasps rippled across the room. The whispers grew louder, confusion mixing with shock. His wife? She's his wife? How is that possible? All this time? Elizabeth looked away, ashamed. "I wasn't ready. I couldn't come back. Not after everything. I lost myself. I didn't deserve you, or this life." Mr. Harris shook his head firmly. "No, you are my wife. No matter what you've been through, no matter what happened, you are still the love of my life." The room was utterly silent now. The same colleagues who had sneered and whispered about Mary were now frozen, realizing the truth. The woman they had judged so harshly was the CEO's wife. John's chest tightened with a mix of emotions: shock, disbelief, but also pride. He had defended her when no one else did, not knowing who she truly was. He glanced at Elizabeth, who looked at him with gratitude shining through her tears. If it hadn't been for John, this moment of reunion might never have happened. The ballroom, once filled with shallow laughter and gossip, now held something different: awe. People looked on as the CEO embraced his long-lost wife, his arms wrapping around her as though afraid she might vanish again. For John, it was a moment he would never forget. His small act of kindness had uncovered a truth that none of them had expected. And though the night had begun with whispers and ridicule, it was now filled with silence, respect, and wonder. The ballroom still buzzed with shock. Moments ago, the woman many had mocked and judged as homeless was revealed to be none other than the CEO's wife. The air was heavy with disbelief. No one touched their food. No one returned to the dance floor. All eyes were fixed on the quiet, trembling figure of Elizabeth Mary. As John had come to know her, Mr. Harris still knelt in front of her, holding her hands tightly as though afraid she would vanish again. His usually steady voice wavered as he whispered, Elizabeth, please, tell me what happened. Why did you leave? Why did you disappear all those years ago?" Elizabeth's chest rose and fell rapidly. She glanced at the employees staring, then at John, whose kind eyes gave her courage. Slowly, she wiped her tears, drew in a shaky breath, and began to speak. "I didn't plan to leave forever," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I only wanted space. Space from the life we lived, from the weight of being constantly watched, being your wife, being in this world of power and wealth. It was overwhelming." Her eyes clouded with memories. "At first, I thought I could manage it. The parties, the cameras, the way people treated me differently because of who I was married to. But over time, I felt like I was losing myself. I wasn't Elizabeth anymore. I was only the CEO's wife." A murmur rippled through the room, employees exchanging stunned glances. They had always admired Mrs. Harris from afar during the early years, but none had known the depth of her struggles. Elizabeth's voice cracked as she continued. "I made mistakes. I trusted the wrong people. I felt trapped in a cage made of gold. And when the pressure became too much, I ran. I thought I'd come back once I found myself again. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and soon shame kept me away. I thought I had failed you." Mr. Harris's grip on her hands tightened, his eyes glistening. "You never failed me. You were my partner, my heart. Losing you nearly broke me. I searched everywhere. Why didn't you reach out? Why live like this?" Elizabeth lowered her gaze. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Because I thought I didn't deserve you anymore. I thought you deserved someone stronger, someone who could stand beside you in that world without falling apart. I lost faith in myself, and when I ended up on the streets, it became harder and harder to come back. Every day I told myself, tomorrow I'll return, but tomorrow never came. I was too ashamed, too afraid." The room was silent, heavy with emotion. Even those who had judged her harshly just hours ago now sat stunned, guilt gnawing at them. The woman they had ridiculed was not just anyone, she was the CEO's beloved wife. And her story was not one of laziness or failure, but of deep personal struggle. John listened, his heart heavy yet filled with admiration. He realized that Mary Elizabeth wasn't just a homeless woman with sad eyes. She was a woman who had fought silently with battles no one could see. She had chosen solitude over a life that made her feel invisible in a different way. Finally, Elizabeth turned to John, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And then you came," she said softly. "You didn't look at me with pity or judgment. You didn't ask about my past or why I was there. You treated me like a person. Do you know how long it's been since someone looked at me that way?" John swallowed hard, unsure what to say. He hadn't expected his simple kindness to unravel into something so enormous. Mr. Harris followed her gaze, finally noticing John properly for the first time that night. He stood and faced him, his voice filled with emotion. You brought her here. If it weren't for you, I might never have seen her again." John shifted uneasily. "I didn't know who she was, sir. I just saw someone who deserved kindness." The CEO's eyes softened. He placed a hand firmly on John's shoulder. "And that is exactly why you are remarkable. You didn't need to know who she was. You simply did what was right." The crowd, still silent, felt the weight of those words. Many lowered their eyes, ashamed of how they had acted earlier in the evening. The same employees who had mocked and whispered now sat humbled, realizing how cruel their judgments had been. Elizabeth, still emotional, reached for her husband's hand. "I don't know if I can step back into that life, Richard," she whispered. "I don't know if I can be the woman everyone expects me to be again." Mr. Harris pulled her gently to her feet, his voice steady and filled with love. "Then don't be who they expect you to be. Be who you are. I don't care what the world thinks. I only care about us. You're my wife, Elizabeth. And if you want to start again, we'll start again together." Her lips quivered, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of healing. The ballroom erupted, not with laughter or gossip, but with applause. It wasn't the usual kind of clapping for a CEO's speech. This was raw, heartfelt. Even those who had judged harshly were now moved by the power of love and forgiveness unfolding before them. John stood to the side, quietly watching, a mix of pride and humility swelling in his chest. He realized that sometimes the smallest gestures, like offering tea or an invitation to a party, could spark life-changing events. His simple kindness had reunited two souls who had been searching for each other in silence for years. Elizabeth looked at him once more, her eyes saying what words could not: gratitude, respect, and something even deeper, the acknowledgement that his compassion had changed her life forever. The stunning revelation was no longer just about who Elizabeth really was. It was about the truth that wealth, titles, and appearances meant nothing without love, kindness, and humanity. And in that ballroom, under the glittering chandelier, everyone felt it. They weren't just witnesses to a reunion. They were witnesses to the power of compassion that had bridged a gap years wide and healed wounds that no riches ever could. The applause in the ballroom slowly faded, but the emotional weight in the air lingered. Everyone had just witnessed something extraordinary. A reunion between a husband and wife torn apart by years of silence and pain. Yet, as the shock settled, people began to realize something else. None of this would have happened if not for John. John stood off to the side, almost trying to disappear into the background. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. All he had done, in his mind, was extend a simple kindness to a woman in need. He never imagined that act would unravel into a story that would shake the entire company. But Mr. Harris, the CEO, would not let that go unnoticed. He straightened, still holding Elizabeth's hand, and turned to face the crowd. His deep, steady voice carried across the ballroom. "Tonight," he began, "we celebrated success, growth, and achievements. But I have just learned something far more important than any company milestone. I have learned that true greatness does not lie in titles, or in wealth, or in power. It lies in kindness." The room grew quiet, every ear straining to catch his words. Mr. Harris looked around at his employees, his eyes sharp yet filled with emotion. "Many of you saw my wife walk into this ballroom tonight, and many of you whispered. You judged her. You dismissed her. But one man did not. One man, without knowing who she was, treated her with respect, dignity, and compassion. That man is John." Dozens of heads turned toward him. John froze, his face flushing red. He wanted to shrink back, to avoid the spotlight, but it was too late. All eyes were on him now. "John," Mr. Harris continued, his voice firm yet warm, "you showed the kind of humanity that cannot be taught in classrooms or measured on performance reports. You saw what others could not. You looked beyond appearances. And in doing so, you gave me back the most precious part of my life, my wife." Elizabeth nodded through her tears, her gaze fixed on John. "He gave me back my courage," she added softly, her voice trembling but clear. "Because of him, I walked into this room tonight. Without him, I might still be sitting outside, invisible to the world." The weight of her words hit the audience. The same people who had laughed, sneered, or gossiped earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed. Mr. Harris reached for a microphone. "I want everyone here to know," he declared, "that while we celebrate business success, the greatest success of this evening belongs to John. His compassion has reminded us all what truly matters." Then, in a move that stunned everyone, the CEO walked over to John. He extended his hand, but instead of just shaking it, he pulled John into a firm embrace. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Employees had seen the CEO shake hands with managers, directors, even politicians, but never had they seen him hug one of his staff so openly. John's chest tightened. He felt overwhelmed, almost embarrassed by the attention, but also deeply moved. He whispered awkwardly, "Sir, I only did what anyone should do." "No," Mr. Harris said firmly, pulling back to look at him. "Not anyone. Many would have walked past her, many did. But you didn't. That makes you extraordinary." The applause returned, this time louder, stronger, and filled with sincerity. It wasn't forced or shallow. It was real. The same colleagues who had mocked him only hours earlier were now clapping for him, some even standing to honor what he had done. For John, it felt surreal. He wasn't used to recognition. He didn't seek praise. In fact, he often preferred to stay unnoticed. Yet here he was, standing at the center of the ballroom, being celebrated by the CEO himself. Elizabeth stepped forward, her eyes shining with tears. She placed a hand over John's. "You reminded me of my worth," she whispered. "I will never forget that." In that moment, John realized the true depth of his actions. He hadn't just offered food or an invitation to a party. He had given a woman hope. He had given her back her place in the world. The CEO turned once again to the crowd. "Let tonight be a lesson to all of us," he said firmly. "We are not defined by what we wear, where we live, or the titles we hold. We are defined by how we treat others, especially those who seem to have nothing to give us in return." John has reminded me, and I hope he reminds all of you. The employees clapped again, many of them looking at John with newfound respect. Those who had once judged him for his simplicity now saw him as someone extraordinary. He had achieved something none of them could claim. He had touched lives in a way that went beyond business or ambition. John, however, remained humble. He smiled faintly and said nothing, choosing instead to let the moment pass without basking in the attention. Deep down, he knew he hadn't done it for recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. But whether he wanted it or not, the honor was his. The CEO's words, the applause of the room, and the gratitude in Elizabeth's eyes, all of it became a memory that would stay with him forever. And so, in a night meant to celebrate corporate success, the greatest story told was not about profits or awards. It was about a quiet man who proved that kindness could change lives. Little did John know, this honor was only the beginning. The lessons from that night would ripple far beyond the ballroom, inspiring others to see the world differently, and reminding everyone that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness carry the greatest power. The ballroom, once filled with chatter, now hummed with a different kind of energy. Something profound had taken place. What began as a celebration of business achievements had turned into a night of lessons that no one present would ever forget. The music still played softly in the background, the chandeliers still sparkled above, but the mood had shifted. The people who had arrived ready to laugh, gossip, and impress had witnessed something far greater, the power of kindness to change lives. John, still standing near the CEO and his wife, felt slightly overwhelmed. He was not a man used to attention. His whole life, he had chosen the quiet path, the path of simplicity, honesty, and compassion. Yet here he was, the center of the story, his name spoken with admiration by the very people who had once overlooked him. He didn't feel like a hero. He only felt like a man who had done what his heart told him to do. Elizabeth wiped her tears and stood tall, her hand still in her husband's. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a broken woman, not as a shadow of her former self, but as herself. She looked around the room, her eyes soft but strong. "All of you looked at me tonight and saw someone to whisper about," she said gently, her voice carrying through the silence. "But one person looked at me and saw a human being. That's all I ever needed to be seen." Her words struck the crowd like a quiet hammer. Many lowered their heads in shame, remembering their stares and whispered remarks. A few wiped their eyes, realizing how quickly they had judged without knowing the truth that Mr. Harris wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his voice steady but full of emotion. My wife is right. Tonight has reminded me and all of us that life is bigger than titles, money, and appearances. We measure success in profits and growth, but the real measure of a person is in how they treat others, especially the ones who seem to have nothing to offer in return. He paused, then gestured to John. This man reminded us of that truth. He didn't just reunite me with my wife, he reminded all of us of the kind of world we should strive to build, inside and outside these walls. The applause that followed wasn't just for John anymore. It was for the lesson, for the awakening that had swept across the room. John smiled faintly, still humbled, still unsure how to process everything. In his heart, he knew this moment wasn't about recognition. It was about what people would carry forward after the party was over. Would they go back to their old ways, chasing wealth and judging appearances? Or would they remember that beneath every face, every worn-out coat, every tired pair of eyes, there was a story waiting to be understood? As the evening drew to a close, Elizabeth approached John quietly. She took his hands in hers, her voice trembling with gratitude. You gave me more than kindness, John. You gave me the courage to step back into the light. I will never forget that. John nodded gently. You don't have to thank me. Sometimes we all just need someone to remind us we matter. That's all I did. Her eyes softened. No, John, you did more than that. You reminded everyone here what it means to be human. When the party ended and the guests began to leave, the whispers had changed. No longer cruel, no longer mocking, now they were filled with respect. People spoke of John's courage, of Elizabeth's strength, of the CEO's love. The story would spread beyond those ballroom walls, retold as a lesson about compassion, humility, and the dangers of judging too quickly. As John walked home that night, the city lights flickering around him, he felt an unusual peace. He hadn't become rich. He hadn't won an award. But he had been part of something greater than himself. He had reminded people of a truth that the world too often forgets, that kindness is never wasted, and though life would return to its normal rhythm, the impact of that night would ripple for years to come. Elizabeth would begin to heal, no longer invisible. Mr. Harris would hold his wife closer than ever, grateful for a second chance. And the employees who had once judged harshly would carry with them the memory of how quickly appearances can deceive. Moral was clear. Behind every face lies a story, and behind every story lies a human being deserving of respect. John's simple act of inviting a woman to a party had become a reminder to everyone that even the smallest gestures could change lives. He hadn't just reunited a husband and wife, he had awakened an entire room to the truth of compassion. And so, the night that began as just another office party ended as something far more extraordinary. A story that would be told and retold. A lesson that would echo in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. Because sometimes, one act of kindness is enough to change everything. Asterisk.